Record. Okay, so thank you to everybody for tuning in, coming in person. We are continuing our shiur on the tefillah, and last week we left off speaking about the korbanot, and essentially we studied the early origins of the korbanot in the sense that we studied where the korbanot, the minhag of the korbanot comes from, the biblical source, the rabbinic source, the sources in the Rishonim, etc. And I'm going to share my screen with you in a second. And the cliff notes of it are that essentially the cliff notes are that the Pesukim in the Navi, originally, just to review last week's shiur, in the Navi'im speak about how Hashem prefers teshuvah and sincere worship, morality, and social justice. Hashem prefers these things over sacrifices and offerings in the temple. This was a criticism of the prophets to the Jewish people, and it's something which is noted in many verses in the Bible, in Tanakh. Now, over time, the idea that sincere worship can replace or be as good as korbanot was developed in rabbinic times to be an understanding that if one could study if one would study the korbanot, or even perhaps even recite them, to recite the words of the korbanot, it would be as if he brought the korbanot in the Beit HaMikdash, almost some sort of segula that if a person says it, it's as if he actually brought it. Now, in the time of the Gaonim, what occurred is that we had a minhag develop that for halachic purposes, the Birchas HaTorah was attached to specific sections of Torah, which would validate the reason for saying Birchas HaTorah. The Gemara has different opinions about what constitutes a valid reason for saying Birchat Torah. And therefore, to fulfill all of the opinions for which you should have an obligation to say Birchat Torah, they decided to say one section of Mikra, one of Mishnah, and one of Midrash, or of a Braita or a Gemara. So for that reason, to constitute a proper Torah learning, these three sections were chosen. Now, why Korbanot? Of course, because Korbanot, the whole Shachrit is brought instead of the Korban Tamid, and therefore, if they were going to choose any Mishnayot or Pasukim, it was supposed to be about the Korbanot, and that's why they chose these. But the reason for saying this section of the Tefillah began with a halachic impetus. As time moved on from the early medieval ages, the Rishonim began to shift the idea, and the idea was now going to become less of a halachic impetus for saying the korbanot section, namely the Parshat Tamid and Ezehu Mikoman and Rabbi Shmuel Omer. Rather, the point was this segula of, let me for the screen share. Hold up, I'm gonna pin myself to just make this a little more private. There we go. And the Rishonim understood saying these three sections as more of as a segula, as if you were going to bring the korbanot. So the whole logic flipped. It used to be halacha first, and then, well, it's a segula anyway, so let's choose these three. And then the logic turned into, these are an amazing segula, but why do we have three sections? Well, that's because you have to be Makayim, Mikra, Mishnah, and Talmud. So the logic flipped. When we got to the modern era, we find that the segula is a lot more powerful of a reason in the eyes, or in the consciousness, really, of the worshipers. And therefore, the attitudes towards this section of the Siddur changes quite significantly. And with the turn of the 15th century into the dawn of a lot of change in the Jewish world, we find accompanying that many changes that come into the Siddur. The end of the 15th century and the 16th century were a massive change for the whole world, not for just the Jews. The church was falling, the printing press was changing how information was shared. The Jews were being expelled from Spain and moving all over the world. And so this time saw a massive amount of development, of confusion, of change. And a lot of it is reflected in the confusion of, and in the confusing order and arrangement of many of the additions and the extra, let's call it the extra components of the Korbanot section of the Tefillah. So tonight, I wanted to go through one by one some of those additions and try to clear up some of the confusion regarding why this section of the davening, the stuff nobody says, why all of that is ordered the way that it's ordered. And I hope to make things more confusing. This is not going to be a conventional shiur because, to my own detriment, I tried making a potpourri shiur, like a 10 great facts about Korbanot, but the greatest plans never survive contact with the enemy. So here we are. I'm going to do my best to go through various different parts of the beginning of the Siddur and try we'll try to learn something tonight. So the first thing I wanted to mention was the way it's laid out in the Ashkenaz Siddurim. Many of the Ashkenaz Siddurim, and I didn't pull one up in front of me, I have a Moroccan one by accident, but many of the Ashkenaz Siddurim begin with the Trumat HaDeshen and the Parashat HaKiyor. Now, the reason for this is a mysterious Orchot Chaim. Orchot Chaim was a sefer written by Rabbi Aaron Milunil from Provence in the end of the 12th century. And Rabbi Aaron HaKohen Milunil wrote this massive sefer called Orchot Chaim. It's like one of the first major halachic works ever written. And it was later abridged and called a sefer. It was later abridged into a smaller sefer called the Kolbo. So the Kolbo, if you ever heard of it, is not really a real sefer. It's really an abridged version of the Orchot Chaim. So in this version, he speaks about the minhagim that people do early in the morning. But the Beit Yosef has a quote from that section, which we do not have. I should have pulled it out. I'm sorry. That we do not have anymore. We don't have it in our Orchot Chaim. But the Beit Yosef essentially says that the Orchot Chaim says that many people have the minhag to say the Parashat HaKiyor, Parashat Trumat HaDeshen, Parashat Pitum HaKitoret, and the Asham and the Chatat and the Olah and the Shlamim. And this is a very valuable source of information. If the Beit Yosef had not put it down, we wouldn't know this. However, because of him, we know that in the late 12th century Provence, people were saying these parts at the beginning of davening. We don't have any other clear source for this. If you look in the Ashkenazi Siddurim, let me just share my screen for a second in that regard. If you look in the Ashkenaz Siddurim, you will find, apologies for the technical difficulty of doing this over Zoom. Sorry. Let's just put this here. Here we go. Let me share this. The Ashkenazi Siddurim definitely do not have any of those extra components, the earlier ones at least the ones that we have from Ashkenaz. They don't have many of those Trumat HaDeshen and Kiyor sections. And also the Sfaradi Siddurim, the earlier ones, and I'll change my screen to which one I'm sharing. Here we go. That should be. No, sorry. I'm gonna have to stop that because it's not accurately showing me what I want to share. But just trust me in the sense that the early Siddurim do not have these extra components. Now, the interesting thing is that the Beit Yosef recommends over there, he seems to be recommending saying these things which are quoted in the Orchot Chaim. And I should mention that also the Orchot Chaim seems to also be quoting Rabbi Yehuda ben Yakar, one of his Rebbeim from Provence. Now, the Sfaradim, who almost always follow the Beit Yosef, just simply never took this on. What we end up finding is that the later Ashkenazi Siddurim in the 1400s begin adding these sections, like the Kiyor and the Trumat HaDeshen. But the Sfaradi Siddurim never added. So apparently the Sfaradim, at least in the Iberian Peninsula and probably in Northern Africa had a pre-existing custom, which was just stronger. Because their pre-existing custom did not include adding the Tumat Hadeshen and the Kior, therefore they simply don't have it. If you're not familiar with what those sections of the parasha are, they are the other preparatory things that were done in the morning of the Beit HaMikdash service. Okay, but that's so much for that section. The next thing I wanted to talk about was something I didn't mention last week about the Korban Tamid, which was how the Korban Tamid worked in the national psychology. So the Korban Tamid begins, for what it's worth, is the most important part of the section of the Korbanot. That's the whole point of saying the Korbanot. The most important Korban to say is the Tamid. One of the things that I failed to mention last week is that in the time while the Beit HaMikdash was standing, the Korban Tamid was not an individual responsibility. The Korban Tamid was a national responsibility. The Gemara learns out from the Pasuk that the chiyuv, well, at least legally speaking, for the Korban Tamid is on Klal Yisrael. It's not on the Kohanim. It's not on the Kohen Gadol. It's not on a specific person that he has to bring the Korban Tamid. It is a national responsibility that all of Klal Yisrael is have to bring the Korban Tamid. So let's say there wasn't enough money to buy a lamb. Let's say the Kohanim decided one day they didn't want to bring it. It would be on the Beit Din to tax the people or to force the Kohanim to bring the Korban Tamid. So therefore, because it was always understood as a national responsibility, it was also understood in line with national repentance. And it was exceedingly important for people for the entire nation to bring the Korban Tamid. We fast every year on the day that the Korban Tamid was Shivat Sar B'Tammuz, when they stopped bringing the Korban Tamid, because it was a national shock that we would no longer be bringing the Korban Tamid. And in the time of the Beit HaMikdash, it was understood as giving atonement every day for Klal Yisrael. So it's not unusual. It's not a surprise that the focus of the Korbanot, that the main Korbanot that were chosen to say would be the Korban Tamid. That was something I wanted to mention last week, but I didn't bring up that fact. Next interesting thing is in the Siddur, before the Tamid, many Siddurim will say, and I think I could pull this up because even the Sfaradi Siddurim should have it, but leave it to the Moroccan Siddurim to confuse you. Give me a second. Here we go. The beginning of every Siddur, before the Korban Tamid, and I'm not sure if this is going to come out backwards on Zoom, I'm sorry, but it's correct? Okay, great. You have the Sihir Atzom Fenecha Hashem Elokeinu Lekevotenu. Shitrachem Aleinu v'timchol lanu et kol chatutenu. V'techaper lanu et kol v'notenu v'timchol v'tislach l'chol pishaenu. Right? So it's a very famous passage, a Yehiratzon, which is said right before the saying the Korban Tamid. In all of the early manuscripts, in all of the early Siddurim, there is no such passage. And let me give you an example here from the Badleyan. Just give me 1 second. If I can exit full screen here, share my screen. Here's just an example of a Sfaradi Siddur in the Oxford University Library. You'll see that after the Akedat Yitzchak, we're gonna have first it does the Korban Tamid, then it does Akedat Yitzchak, and then wait, am I going backwards by accident? I probably am. Here we go. Right. Then we have Birkat Torah, Yivrecha Hashem Yishmerecha, the Korban Tamid. Right. Then we bring the Korban Tamid directly after. So what you're seeing here is the way all of the earlier Siddurim used to do it. You have the Berachos Shachar, Birkat Torah. After Birkat Torah, you have the Birkat Kohanim, and then directly into Korban Tamid. We discussed this already 2 or 3 times, that the whole point of the Korban Tamid in the earliest formats was to follow right after Birkat Torah. So because the Korban Tamid in all of the earlier Siddurim, and even in the minhag of the entire Germany until like literally 200 years ago, because the minhag was to say the Korban Tamid directly after the Birkat Torah, you simply don't find a Yehiratzon in any of the earlier Siddurim, whether it's from the 1300s, the 1400s, you just don't find it. We don't find this Yehiratzon until you get to the printed Siddurim. This Yehiratzon was invented by some rabbi or some printer who wanted to add a Hiratzon before the Tamid, since the Tamid was no longer attached to the Birkat Torah. Now, he didn't completely invent it because this Hiratzon is actually stolen. This Hiratzon is a borrowing of the exact same Hiratzon we say in the Vidoy of Yom Kippur. At the end of the Shemona Esrei of Yom Kippur, we say Al Chet Shechatan L'Fnecha Be'ones, Bivlidat, right? We do the whole Aleph Bet. So in that Al Chet, there's a very short Hiratzon with the exact same language as this, and this is where it's taken from. And we saw this also this is an idea borrowed from the Ribbon, the Elokeinu V'Kivitenu Paktenu B'Pkudat Yeshua V'Rachamim that we say after the Akedah, which is also borrowed from the Rosh Hashanah davening. So for this reason, the printer or the rabbi decided to borrow the Hiratzon from the Yom Kippur davening to introduce the Korban Tamid, and it's really a mixture of the Hiratzons. We don't know who the author is, but it seems, since we only see it in the printed Siddurim, we could assume that this was invented at the late 1500s, the late 15th century or the early 16th century. That's the most we know about it. I couldn't find any more information in the past couple of years I've been researching, so maybe one day I'll find another clue, but that's the story of that Yehiratzon. And if you're interested, there is a lot of material on this in the Yom Kippur. If we would cover the Yom Kippur davening, there is quite a bit of material on this. Okay. What next do we have to see? Give me 1 second. Okay. So regarding Ezahu Mikoman. Ezahu Mikoman is the fifth parak of sorry, not the fifth parak. The fifth parak of Zvachim, I believe. Right? I'm not crazy. I'm sorry, when you spend this much energy, you kind of go crazy. Yeah, the fifth parak of Zvachim. Now, there are certain Masechtot, like Masechet Tamid, and certain areas of Masechet Zvachim and Midot, which are written differently than most of the Mishnayot in Shas. Most of the Mishnayot in Shas are written legally. They're written in a shorthand legal fashion, and they bring multiple opinions from multiple sides. What's interesting about this parak in which Ezu Mikoman and the Mishnayot in Tamid is that they stand out from regular Mishnayot in that they're written as in a more narrative sense, right? If you read many prakim in Tamid, or you read this parak in Ezu Mikoman, you get the sense that sometimes it's a narrator speaking, as if he has firsthand experience, like what exactly would happen, right? Especially if you learn the prakim in Tamid, as we did last time we studied it. The reason for this is the Mishnayot of Tamid are very, very early, and they were written by the first Tanaim. And the first Tanaim, for them, the Beit HaMikdash was still standing. It was a living reality, or even after it was destroyed, a living memory. So when they recorded the halachot of what happened in the Beit HaMikdash, it's very much in the first person. It's very much a story rather than halachot. What's special about this parak Ezo Mikoman Shel Zvachim is that there's not one machloket in the entire parak. The Ra'ah in Brachot, Aflamed Bet Amud Beit, points this out. And he points out that he says that he heard from his Rebbeim that because there's not a single machloket in this parak, it is a signal, really a sign, that this parak is directly L'Moshe Missinai. It's the only Mishnah that we have which is directly L'Moshe Missinai, and not a single error or forgetfulness or a single mistake ever occurred in it. It was forever remembered perfectly. And this and it's exceedingly ancient because it was spoken by Moshe Rabbeinu. It's interesting that the Tikkun Tefillah, Rabbi Leib Gordon, in the 1800s, the early 1900s, he writes, you should know that it doesn't mention the wall of the Beit HaMikdash. It doesn't say HaKotel. It says, I'm looking for the word here. It says Me'achorei HaKilaim, from behind the curtains on the rods. And he just says, by the way, the Beit HaMikdash didn't have kilaim. The Beit HaMikdash had a wall, didn't have these curtains. So either this is as ancient as Shiloh, or it's even more ancient, which is just a brilliant thing to point out, that the Mishnah has such an ancient language of kilaim. He believes the language in the Hebrew here is really very ancient and might actually go back to Halacha L'Moshe Missinai. So I thought that was a very fascinating thing to share. Again, if anybody's interested in the line by line, the studying of the Ezehu Mikoman or the Masechet Tamid or any of these or any of the parashiot in the section of the Korbanot, please refer to the much earlier shurim we did, like number 16, I don't know, maybe number 12, 13, 14. We went through all of the Korbanot line by line. Okay. What next? The Ketoret. Here's an interesting fact. In the time of, I'm sorry about the exposure on the camera, in the time of the earliest of the early medieval times, let's say the Geonim and the early Rishonim, the Ketoret was understood as something that you said after davening, not something that you said before davening. Most of the time, the Ketoret was recited after Enkel Elokeinu by Shachrit, after Arvit by either Nefilat Apayim, or they would do it like a Tachnun after Arvit. There were minhagim to do all sorts of things after Arvit that have been lost to time. But one of the things that people would do after Arvit was Pitum HaKetoret. It's not until a little bit later, if I'm not mistaken, it's in the 1200s, in Provence, that we begin seeing people use the Pitum HaKetoret, the Ketoret section, as something to be said at the beginning of davening. Up until that point, up until the 1200s, it's really an end of davening thing. It started to shift to also be used at the beginning of davening. The Mekubalim have various reasons why you put it before and you put it after. The functions of Pitum HaKetoret are to really separate any evil forces from are really to separate any evil forces from going up with your tefillah before or after the tefillah. So that for that reason, its function is over there. But let me show you something fascinating that's very few people have seen. It's very famous that the Rebbe Eliezer Rokeach, one of the great scholars of Germany, lost his wife and his daughter, maybe more than one daughter, to ruffians, really to vagrants, two Christian burglars who burst into his house and murdered his family, probably for religious zeal, but obviously nothing excuses what they did. And the authorities did find them, and the authorities did kill them, but it didn't, lessen the tragedy. And Rabbi Eliezer Rokeach writes exactly what happened. Eliezer, I was in the middle of writing Parshas, my Pirush Al HaTorah on Parshas Vayeshev, and these two people came in and they killed my wife and my daughter. He goes through the whole thing, and then he writes a poem in memory of his wife, whose name was Dolce. Her name was Dolce because it's Italian, and it means sweet. Most of the early Ashkenazic settlers were Italians, and for his daughter's name was Belet, which I believe is also an Italian name. And he writes a poem, a kina, so to speak, a dirge for his wife, who he lost. It's incredible that he was so young. He was in his 20s. He lost his wife and half his children, and he still managed to pull himself together and lead Klal Yisrael. It's really incredible fortitude that you see and resilience. But one of the lines of his poem here, he writes something beautiful. He says, right? She would sing zmirot and prayers, and she would speak in supplications. Her hands would be raised in singing Nishmat Kol Chai, Kol Maminim, and the famous poem that they used to sing back then called Kol Maminim. The Ashkenazim are familiar with it still because they say it in Rosh Hashanah, Musaf. But Kol Maminim back then was clearly recited as like a more memorable poem that the women would sing. No emet Pitum HaKetoret, she would say Pitum HaKetoret v'aseret davarim, and aseret dibrot every morning. And throughout the province, she would teach her fellow women to sing and to pray. So in this dirge that he writes for his wife, we see that in the 1200s in Ashkenaz, in Worms, it was popular for even some women to say Pitum HaKetoret at a certain point during davening. We don't know where, possibly after the davening. He puts it in line with Nishmat Kol Chai and Kol Maminim. So for some reason, this was prevalent and it was being used in Ashkenaz in the 1200s. We don't know at what point during davening, but that's just a very fascinating early source that I thought I would share with you. Okay, how can we move on from here? Right. So the Pitum HaKtoret ends in many Siddurim with Hashem tzivakot imanu miskab lanu Elokei Yaakov sela Hashem tzivakot asher adam boteach bach Hashem Hoshia melech yanenu v'yom korenu. The Beit Yosef, this all comes from the Beit Yosef in Siman Nun. The Beit Yosef says we should end with these. Why? Because in the Yerushalmi in Parak Hey in Brachot, it says that a person should always have these pesukim on his lips. Doesn't say why. Doesn't say, it says it's somehow that it's going to be a protection for him, but it doesn't really say why it'll be a protection for him. But the Yerushalmi says a person should always have these pesukim on his lips, and for that reason, we add it to many places in the tefillah. This is just one of the first places. That comes from the Arizal, who says that that's a misugal pasuk to say, to bring your korbanot together as if you're bringing your korbanot to Shemayim. Abaye have misader seder hamaracha. My notes, I couldn't find this in time, and I apologize. But the Tur is the first person to suggest this. In Memchet, he says that people should say Abai have a Meseder Seder Maracha. This is a Braita in Yoma, and it basically essentially goes through the service of the day in the Beit HaMikdash. It's a shorthand for the service of the day through in the Beit HaMikdash. Now, as far as I saw, the last time I studied this was that the Tur was the first person to suggest this. In the late, I think the Torah would be the early 1300s. And I wrote in my notes that I later found in the Badleyan Siddurim, in the Badleyan collection, that there were other Siddurim which also had a Baya Hava Meseder Maracha. I could not find it in time for the Shiur, but clearly, if the Torah is saying Tov Lomar, it's not like he's inventing it. It's more likely that this wasn't birthed in a vacuum. It's likely that in Sfarad or in Ashkenaz, this idea was popular and he was just promoting the idea of saying Habaya Hava Meseder. So we could confidently say that Abai having Meseder Seder Maracha was added in medieval times, roughly the 1300s, the early 14th century. Okay. What's next? Is this the most fun part? Yes. We're at the most fun part. Ana b'koach. Let me, God willing, share my screen here. Let's start. Let me share my screen. Let's do it this way. Share screen. Okay, here's the Gemara in the Yerushalmi. I was gonna share this slide. I'm sorry that's a little haphazard because we're not focusing on a single tefillah tonight. This is the Gemara in Yerushalmi. Chizkiya bar Yaakov baracha Rabbi Yosef b'Shem Rabbi Yochanan l'olam al yeh pasuk hazeh zaz mitot picha Hashem sekot imanu sekot sela Rabbi Yosef ben Rabbi Yevin bar Rabbi b'Shem Rabbi Yochanan v'chavreya Hashem sekot asher damoteach bach. This is the makar for saying these pesukim so many times throughout the day. Okay, so Hashem. So the next thing we're going to discuss is Ana B'koach Dulati Minchat Tatir Tzirura. So this famous piyut was first studied well by a professor named Moshe Chalamish, who's a huge expert in Kabbalah and in Tefillah. He wrote in an article in the Da'at journal in a very exhaustive piece about the history of this piyut of Ana B'koach. Let's try to do the cliff notes for where this all comes from. The first place to start, I don't know how long we're going so far, but I'm going to try my best to go through this quickly. The first place to start, if we're going to study Ana B'koach, and I want to do just the cliff notes, just as short as possible, is the Gemara in Kiddushin. The Gemara in Kiddushin is famous for extolling the virtues of the special name of God, which has 42 letters. This is the Shem Hashem with Membe Tevot. Let me find it here. Amar Rabba Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Shem ben Abra Otiot Chachamim Osin Oto L'Talmideihem Pam Achat B'Shavua. The 42-letter name of God, the scholars would give it to their students once every 7 years. And some say, V'amila Pamim B'Shavua, twice every 7 years. Amar V'Nachman Bar Yitzchak U'Mistavra Kimad Pam Achat B'Shavua. It's more mistavra that they would do it once every 7 years. Tichtiv, as it says, Zeh Shmi La'olam, Le'elam Ktiv. It's written as if it is Le'elam, as if it's hidden. Rava Savar L'Midashei B'Pirka, Amar Le'ah Husab Le'elam Ktiv. Rava wanted to actually to be Doresh in one of his lectures, and a certain I think Hahusaba would be Rav, told him, not Rav, Rabba told him, it says Le'elam. Some people say Ahusaba always means Eliyahu Navi, but I'm not sure where that comes from. Okay, Rabbi Avina Rami Ktiv Zeh, V'Ktiv Zeh, says Shemi Zeh Zechid Kol Vadar. So then Gemara says, no, you say Shem Hashem with Yud Vavke, and then but you pronounce it Alf Tal Nun Yud. Finally, it says, Tana Rabbanan Birshona Shem Ben Shtayim Esei Otiot Hayu Mosino To Lechol Adam Mishrabu Hapritzim Hayu Mosino To Letzinuim Shebekuhuna. Letzinuim Shebekuhuna Mavlim Otam Benimat Achem HaKohanim. So essentially, originally, all of the Jewish people knew this 42-letter name of God. When people started using it for magical purposes that they shouldn't have been using it for, they only gave it to people who were able to keep private things private. When the Kohanim would say the Birkat Kohanim, they would then say it quietly, or they would like swallow it so people couldn't hear how they pronounced the 42-letter name of God. Tanya Amar Rabbi Tarfon, who lived during the time of the Beit HaMikdash, said, I once went with my uncle to do the duchening. Rabbi Tarfon is giving us a first-hand report of how in the Beit HaMikdash he heard the Kohen Gadol say it very quietly so that other people could not hear how to actually pronounce the Shem and Bet. Lastly, it says, in Mosino To, Rabbi Yehuda says that you should not say this name, Elosh Misanua Vana Ve'omed B'Chatzi Ama Ve'eno Koes Ve'eno Mishtaker Ve'eno Mamid Al Midotav V'Yodo V'Ezir Bo V'Mesham Robi Tara Uhuv L'Mal V'Nechman L'Mat Ve'emato Mutelat Al Abriot V'Nochel Shnei Olamim Ha'olam Hazeh V'Olam Haba. Fascinating how the Gemara extols the virtues of knowing and understanding and using the name of the Shem Hashem properly. It seems that the Gemara understands that the Shem and Bet is very powerful. Somebody who knows how to pronounce it or to configure it can use it for magical purposes. Therefore, it's very dangerous for those who are immature or don't have the impulse control to not use it for when they get angry. It should be kept away from those people. And the Gemara extols the virtues of those who are zocha to know it and understand it and learn it. Now that's the Gemara, but you fast forward 800 years, and the Geonim, by the time the Geonim is completely forgotten. Bahai Gaon says, we know the order of the letters, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Yud, Taf, Tzadi. We just don't know how to configure them. Bahai Gaon in the Chuat Gaonim says, he replies to a letter asking him, how does this work? He says, honestly, we don't have a good Misorah about the pronunciation and the order of these letters. What we do know is that our Misorah is to divide it into 7 times 6. There's 7 configurations of 6 letters at a time, but we don't know the pronunciation. And he goes on to talk about a little bit about the different versions and how the Shem Hashem is important. That's the situation you have in the time of the Geonim. As the centuries move on, in the time of the Rishonim, we see different acrostic poems written to recite and to remember this 42-letter name of God. Now, some of the early ones are mostly forgotten to time, but the best surviving one is Ana Bekoach Dulati Minachat Tatir Tzirura. There were many others, and I'll show you on my screen some examples that Moshe Chalamish brings. Let me try to share my screen again. Apologies if this doesn't work perfectly. Oh, here we go. Share. Here's some examples of other ones from Sfarad. Ana be'esh kivurat. It's going to move out of my way. Yadachat lehet sari kadosh le'ean. Anotis agvenu tareini na nimot kidultecha darashti yichud kavod shemecha. The Shalah brings the second one. Kel baruch gedol yirat tom sidkotav. And here he brings 2 more from the Hasidei Ashkenaz, right? You have one here. Elokim Yisrael gadol yichudecha tzedkaveinu tzidkatecha. To make a very long story short, Moshe Chalamish analyzes a lot of data, like from many manuscripts, from many Sfarim, from many sources. It's really an incredible amount of data that he crunches. And his impression is that the source of Ana Bekoach is originally from the circleship of the Hasidei Ashkenaz, but it was popularized in Spain. That's his suspicion, that the Spanish scholars like this one more than any other piyut. It's well known that the Rashba in his Teshuvot says that the Shem Membet, this 42-letter name of God, we have a bakasha from Rabbi Nechunya ben Akana, one of the Tanaim, which is known to be the to be an acrostic of Ana B'Koach. Later, a lot of people called this the Tfilat of Nechune ben Akana. It's not clear if the Rashba is actually talking about Ana B'Koach. There was another tefillah called Ana B'Koach, called Tfilat of Nechune ben Akana. There are other acrostics, so it's not 100% sure that that's what the Rashba is talking about. However, 1 second. However, of all of these bakashot and all of these slichot, of all of these various poems, the best surviving one is the Ana B'Koach Gdulat Yeminacha Tatir Tzura, which is essentially some sort of poem, which is a bakasha. It sounds like a bakasha for the Shliach Tzibor that he's asking that his tefillot should be accepted, because it's really a remembrance, a meditation on the 42-letter name of Hashem. For that reason, at the end of it, many Siddurim started adding the words Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. One of the understandings of this tefillah was that it's because it's a bakasha, it should be added to the other sections of bakashot, which is very famous at the beginning of many Moroccan Siddurim and others. You have a whole section called bakashot. However, in the 15th century, the late 15th century, the early 16th century, we find a phenomenon where the Ana B'Koach starts getting plopped right after Pitum HaKetoret, and we have no idea why. The Ramak brings this minhag, the Arizal brings this minhag, and finally in the Siddurim in the 1540s, we begin seeing it printed that they would say Ana B'Koach right after Pitum HaKetoret. So the Arizal gives the Kabbalistic reasons for it, why it should be structured here. The Seder Hayom from Moshe ben Mechir gives a reason al pi pshat, which I think is much easier to understand than the Arizal's reasons, because all the Mekubalim speak in code here. They speak about why exactly it belongs after Pitum HaKetoret, and it has to do with the Midat HaGvura, how the Shem and Beit associates with the Midat HaGvura. Essentially, what the Seder Hayom says is something much more easy to understand. He says that we know that the Bikat Kohanim is said right after the Parashat HaTamid, or right before it, and we know that the Kohanim used to say the Shem and Beit when they would say the 42-letter name of Hashem in substitute for Yud Kei Vav Kei. Therefore, it makes the most sense to add the meditation of the Shem and Beit into the section of the Korbanot. That's the Seder Hayom's reason. Some scholars thought that this was just a ridiculous addition, that many of the Siddurim that put it here had no business putting it here, that it has actually no reason for here, and the reason for being here, and it's just complete silliness. What's interesting is that the Arizal's own Siddur, the Siddur that Rav Chaim Vital claims that the Arizal used to use, is the Siddur Reish Pei Dalet, the Siddur from the year 1523. The Siddur from the year 1523 is really funny because I could show you those pages. It does not contain Ana B'Koach. It doesn't actually contain quite a few things that Rav Chaim Vital says that a person should say. However, 20 years later, there was a reprint of the Siddur Reish Pei Dalet in the year Shin Dalet, in the year 1543. And in that edition, which I'm not showing here, it does have a few extra additions like Ana B'Koach in that section. It's not clear if it's possible that when the Rav Chaim Vital said that the Arizal is always using the Siddur Reish Pei Dalet, he really meant the Siddur Shin Dalet, which was the reprint of the Siddur Reish Pei Dalet. Regardless, if by the 1540s, the printers were putting in Ana B'Koach within Pitum HaKetoret, it would seem that at least for 50, 70 years, people were sticking Ana B'Koach into the Pitum HaKetoret. It's a complete mystery. We don't know why. We don't know who decided to plop it in there. Was it completely Kabbalistic? We just have no idea. The fact is, it ended up there, and the reason for it is lost to history. Okay. Lastly, do we have anything else to cover? Yeah. Finally, Ribon Olamim Matat Tzvitanu La'akiv Korban Tamid V'Mo'ado V'Liot Kohanim Avodatam Leviim B'Duchanam Yisrael B'Ma'amadam. This is the section which is an introduction to the Ezehu Mikoman in most Siddurim. So the Mikar, the source for this tefillah, straight up seems to be the Torah. I don't see another way of understanding the composition of this. If the Torah himself, if Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher himself didn't write this, in my opinion, it seems to be that the Torah himself wrote this tefillah. So I've never found it in an earlier Siddur or in an earlier manuscript, and it's my assumption that when Rabbi Yaakov Asher was writing in, I think this is in Memchet, in Siman Memchet, when he's writing about Ezim Kuman, he says, and before a person does this, he should say, that now that we don't no longer have the Korban Tamid, it should be as if when we recite this, it should be as if we brought it. One more thing that Torah says that we should say, and we're going to end with this. The Torah says that we should say the parashav the Asham, the parashav the Chatat, the parashav the Shlamim, meaning the actual pasukim from the Torah. And then he says, and after you say it, you should say Yehiratzon. It should be as if I brought the Korban Tamid. Yehiratzon should be as if I brought the Korban Hasham. And he writes his own very small nusach over there. Same way he wrote this little nusach of Ribon Olamim. What's funny though is that if you look in the Siddurim, they put those Yehiratzon. None of the Siddurim write these parashiot. They don't write the pasukim from the Torah. It seems that for some reason it was never popular to do. But they took this same idea and they put it in between the parakim, the chapters of Ezeu Mekoman. And this comes from the Drisha, who says his Rebbe, the Marshal, did this as well, that because the Siddurim and most Minhagim don't have to say the parashiyot themselves, therefore, what's the difference? Let's just say this Yehiratzon of the Torah right after every parak, like the parak of the Olah, the parak of the Parim, the parak of the Chatat Tzibor, just say Yehiratzon, it should be in between every single one of the parakim. And this is what you'll find in many of the Siddurim from like the Hasidic Siddurim, and many Siddurim which are like Nusach Sfard, and even some of the Nusach Ashkenaz Siddurim from like the Avodas Yisrael has this addition. It's not exactly what the Torah meant to do, but that's why it's there. If you ever wondered why you have your Siddur has a Yehiratzon in between every parak, it's kind of because of the Torah, but kind of not. Lastly, the section ends with Rabbi Yishmael Omer, which is probably the most appropriate midrash or braita to bring, because this is a all-encompassing braita, midrash, Talmud, which encompasses how to learn out halachot from all of the previous pesukim from the Tamid. I'm not sure if we're going to give a shir again on Rabbi Yishmael Omer because the 13 principles are complicated, but essentially the importance of it became so magnanimous that the Ben Ish Chai holds that it's a chiyuv to say it every day. I never understood why he thought it was an actual chova, but Rabbi Yishmael Omer became like really important as if it's some sort of chiyuv. Now, I'm not sure what we're going to continue with next week. If we want to embellish, go on with Rabbi Yishmael Omer. If we want to go to Hodu or Kaddish, I'm not sure what we're going to continue with next week. But I think for the most part, we're going to close the section of Korbanot with these added facts, with this added information. I hope this was informative. I hope everybody had learned something. And let me just make sure that we've used up all of my slides, because otherwise it would be a miss. No, yeah, we did. Okay, Baruch Hashem. So thank you to everybody for joining. Thank you for your time, for your attention, your patience. Bezrat Hashem, next week we'll continue with either Hashem Melech or Kaddish or something like that. One thing just before I end the recording that I want to mention is that if we want to learn a lesson in how to study the Siddur from the Shiur, if you just want to walk away with something, the most important thing to understand is that the past 500 years of the development of the Siddur are extremely complicated, because there are so many Siddurim, there are so many, incunabula, there are so many late manuscripts. Studying how certain late stage things got into the Siddurim can be very complicated, and it's typically an exercise in bibliography more than it is an exercise in prayer study or theology. A lot of it is accidents, a lot of it is printer freedom, and a lot of it is coincidence. And therefore, studying some of the late stage stuff is an area which I will touch on a little bit less than other areas in studying the Siddur. So that's just a note I wanted to make at the end here. And with that, I will, Bezrat Hashem, end the recording. Cancel. Let's do that.